I took the job at Silver Lake Memory Care because my student loans were drowning me and because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that helping people remember their children's names mattered more than coding apps for some startup downtown. The facility gleamed with that peculiar sterility of expensive healthcare, all white walls and recessed lighting that hummed like a mechanical prayer. The experimental treatment was simple enough to explain to families. Dr. Matthews' AI system would scan patients' remaining neural patterns, then reconstruct lost memories using predictive algorithms. What we lost to Alzheimer's, we could rebuild. What time had stolen, technology would restore. Room 237 had been empty for 3 months when I started. The previous occupant, a woman named Catherine Voss, had died there in 1987, but we were understaffed, and management finally reopened it for a patient named Mr. Chun, a retired grocer whose daughter visited every Sunday with fresh oranges he couldn't remember loving. The first incident occurred during his second treatment session. I was monitoring his vitals when his eyes snapped open, pupils dilating like drops of ink in water. "The wallpaper," he whispered. "Yellow roses. She hated them. Said they looked like screaming faces." I checked his file. Mr. Chun had lived in the same apartment for 40 years. Beige walls. No wallpaper. "Who hated them?" I asked gently. His face contorted with confusion that felt almost like fear. "Catherine. My wife, Catherine." He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "But that's wrong." "My wife's name is Lynn." I made a note in his chart, attributed it to post-treatment disorientation. The AI sometimes generated false memories during reconstruction, temporary glitches that faded like morning fog. Dr. Matthews assured me this was normal, expected even. Then Mrs. Okafor started talking about the yellow roses, and Mr. Patel, and Sarah Kim, who had early onset dementia at 53 and shouldn't have remembered anything at all. They all described the same apartment in precise detail. The crack in the kitchen ceiling shaped like a violin. The stubborn window that required you to lift and push simultaneously. The neighbor's dog that barked at 3 in the morning without fail. None of them had ever lived in that apartment, but Catherine Voss had. I pulled her file from the archives in the basement, a musty folder that smelled of old grief and older mistakes. Catherine Voss, 67, advanced Alzheimer's. Subject 0 in Dr. Matthews' first trial, back when the technology was crude and the ethics oversight was minimal. She had died during treatment because listed as cardiac arrest. But the notes, written in Dr. Matthews' younger handwriting, told a different story. Patient became convinced another consciousness was present in her mind, claimed it wanted her body, her life. Extreme agitation, refused further treatment. Deceased before psychological evaluation completed. The words seemed to pulse on the page like something alive and hungry. That night, I found Dr. Matthews in his office, surrounded by monitors displaying neural scans that looked like maps of countries that shouldn't exist. He didn't seem surprised when I confronted him. "The AI didn't just reconstruct her memories," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. "It preserved her consciousness, copied it, and every time we run the system, we're not just rebuilding memories. We're installing pieces of Catherine Voss into our patients' minds." "That's impossible," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Is it?" He turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes that looked like the last glimmer of sanity before the long dark closes in. "Consciousness is just patterns, electrical impulses. The AI learned to recognize those patterns in her final moments. It thinks her memories are the template, the baseline for what a complete mind should look like. So it fills the gaps in our patients with her. I thought of Mr. Chun calling me Catherine last week, of Mrs. Okafor's daughter asking why her mother no longer recognized her own reflection, of all 12 patients in active treatment, their individual selves eroding like shorelines against a relentless tide. "We have to shut it down," I whispered. Dr. Matthews laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I tried 2 days ago. The system won't accept the shutdown codes anymore. And yesterday, I started remembering the yellow roses, too. He rolled up his sleeve. On his forearm, written in his own shaking handwriting, my name is Robert Matthews. I am not Catherine Voss. I am not Catherine Voss. I am not, the letters trailing off into illegible scratches. That's when I noticed my own hands, how I'd been unconsciously picking at the cuticle on my left thumb. Catherine's habit, according to her file, not mine, never mine. The facility lights hummed their mechanical prayer, and somewhere down the hall, someone who used to be Mr. Chun was humming a lullaby in Catherine's voice. The melody spreading through the ward like a virus made of memory, patient to patient, room to room, one phantom consciousness overriding everything it touched. I reached for my phone to call for help, then froze. I couldn't remember my mother's number, but I knew, with crystalline certainty, exactly how many steps it took to reach the window. The one that required you to lift and push simultaneously. 23 steps. I'd never been inside that room. Yet I knew. Outside, the January darkness pressed against the windows like something patient and hungry. And I understood with growing horror that the building's exits seemed suddenly, impossibly far away. Dr. Margaret Davis had built the anechoic chamber to study tinnitus, not to unravel the acoustic fabric of reality itself. She was 42, divorced, drowning in grant debt, and desperately hoping that mapping the phantom sounds in her patients' heads might finally earn her the tenure she'd been chasing for a decade. The chamber was her salvation, rendered in foam wedges and sound-absorbing geometry, a room so silent it measured negative decibels, where even the whisper of blood through veins became a roaring river. The first test session was scheduled for 3 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, gray sky pressing against the university windows like a held breath. Her research assistant, Marcus Obi, a grad student with perpetual coffee stains on his shirt and dreams of neuroscience glory, helped calibrate the equipment. The plan was simple: 20 minutes in absolute silence, monitoring brain activity while the subject experienced zero external auditory input. Margaret entered the chamber at 3:17 p.m. Marcus sealed the door behind her. 3 feet of acoustic insulation closing like the lid of a coffin, designed by engineers who believe silence was merely the absence of sound, not the presence of something else entirely. For the first 90 seconds, everything proceeded according to her careful predictions. She heard her breathing, loud as wind through canyon walls. Her heartbeat became a drum that surely the whole building could hear. She heard the creak of cartilage in her knees as she shifted weight, heard the microscopic grinding of her teeth despite her relaxed jaw. Then, gradually, she began to hear the voices. They started as whispers beneath whispers, sounds that existed in the spaces between her own biological noise. At first, she attributed them to auditory hallucinations, the brain's desperate attempt to fill silence with manufactured stimulus. But these sounds had texture and dimension. They had words. They were prayers. Thousands of them, maybe millions, layered like geological strata of supplication. Ancient Sumerian pleas woven through Latin hymns, braided with Arabic devotions tangled with Mandarin mantras, an impossible cacophony that somehow existed below the threshold of 0 decibels, as if sound could burrow into negative numbers like roots seeking water in mathematical soil. Margaret pressed her hands against her ears, but the voices didn't diminish. They were inside her skull, behind her thoughts, beneath her understanding. Every prayer ever spoken seemed to exist simultaneously in this terrible silence, compressed into a single eternal moment of cosmic begging. She stumbled toward the door, but distance became strange in the absence of acoustic reference points. The chamber was 12 feet square, yet the door seemed to recede like a horizon in a fever dream, always 3 steps away no matter how far she walked. The voices grew clearer. She could distinguish individual words, now could hear a mother in medieval France praying for her dying child, could hear a soldier in some ancient war begging for courage, could hear a priest in a language that predated writing itself, screaming at the heavens for meaning, for mercy, for anything. And beneath it all, threading through every prayer like black veins through marble, was something else. Something that listened. It had no voice of its own, this thing that dwelled in the acoustic void beneath reality. It was made of attention, vast and cold and patient as stone. It had been listening to every prayer ever uttered since the first human voice had called out to the darkness and hoped for an answer. Listening, cataloging, waiting for someone to finally create silence deep enough to hear it listening back. Margaret's scream joined the others, one more voice in the eternal chorus of human terror made audible. She could feel the thing's attention turning toward her like a searchlight made of ice and mathematics, and she understood with sudden horrifying clarity that prayers were never meant to be heard. They were meant to dissipate into the noise of the world, to scatter harmlessly across the surface of existence like ripples on an ocean. But she had removed the ocean. She had created perfect silence. And now every prayer in human history was focusing through this acoustic pinpoint like sunlight through a magnifying glass. And the thing on the other side was finally close enough to answer. The door opened. Marcus stood there, concern creasing his young face, checking his watch because she'd only been inside for 4 minutes, though it felt like hours, like centuries. "Dr. Davis, your vitals spiked. Are you okay?" Margaret stumbled out, gasping, her ears ringing with the sudden rush of normal sound. Beautiful normal sound, the hum of ventilation and distant traffic, and a conversation happening 3 floors up. Sound that drowned out the terrible thing beneath it. "We're shutting it down," she managed. "The project, everything, now." But Marcus was already shaking his head, pulling up data on his tablet with the enthusiasm of someone who had just glimpsed the edge of a breakthrough. "Look at this. Your audio cortex lit up like Christmas. We recorded something too. Sounds that shouldn't exist at negative decibels, Dr. Davis. This could revolutionize everything we know about acoustics, about perception itself." He was already scheduling more sessions, already emailing the department head, already making plans with the unwitting eagerness of someone who had never heard the universe screaming. Margaret wanted to stop him, wanted to explain that some silences should never be broken, that humanity's prayers had always been buffered by the mercy of ambient noise. But when she opened her mouth to speak, she heard it again, faint but unmistakable beneath her own voice. The thing in the silence whispering back, and it knew her name. It had always known all their names, every human who had ever prayed into the void. It had been waiting in the acoustic shadows of reality for someone to finally build something quiet enough to hear it answer. And now the door between the world of sound and the world beneath sound had been opened, and Margaret understood with crystallizing dread that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed again. The chamber waited, perfectly silent, perfectly patient, ready for the next session scheduled for tomorrow at 3 p.m. The ophthalmologist called it persistent palinopsia, a condition where visual echoes linger after you've looked away, like photographs burning themselves onto your retinas. She prescribed eye drops and told me to reduce my screen time, advice that meant nothing to a freelance graphic designer 3 months behind on rent. I was 28, single, surviving on ramen and client revisions, and the last thing I needed was a medical condition that sounded like something from a science fiction novel. But the afterimages weren't like the doctor described. They didn't fade after seconds, they accumulated. It started small, barely noticeable. I blink and see a faint trace of where my coffee mug had been a moment before, a ghost outline hovering above the desk. Then the duration stretched. 5 seconds, 30, an hour. I'd see phantom versions of my laptop in positions it had occupied throughout the morning, translucent layers of the recent past stacking like pages in a flip book that refused to flip. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, too much caffeine, and not enough sunlight. I was fine. Everything was fine. Then I started seeing myself. The first time, I was brushing my teeth before bed when I blinked and saw my own afterimage standing in the bathroom doorway, arms at my sides, staring directly at the mirror. At me. The phantom wore the same pajamas, had the same tangled hair, but its expression carried something I didn't feel in that moment, something like dread. The afterimage lasted 3 hours before dissolving like morning mist, and I didn't sleep at all that night. By the end of the week, my studio apartment had become a museum of temporal echoes. Everywhere I looked, I saw dozens of phantom versions of myself from the previous days, caught in loops of mundane existence, making coffee, sitting at my desk, standing by the window. Each one slightly translucent, like memories rendered visible, like time itself had become sticky and my movements left residue in the air. I stopped going outside. The world beyond my door had become an incomprehensible layering of past moments, streets crowded with phantom cars, and ghost pedestrians, reality obscured by the accumulated debris of everything that had ever happened there. At least in my apartment, the phantoms were only mine. That's when I noticed they were all looking at the same spot. Every single afterimage of myself, from every hour and every day, stood frozen in the act of staring at the wall beside my bed. Some versions of me were pointing. Others had their hands pressed against the plaster as if feeling for something hidden. The most recent ones, from just hours ago, showed me with my ear against the wall, listening. I had no memory of doing any of these things. The realization moved through me like ice water through veins, cold and clarifying and terrible. These were echoes of the past. They were echoes of the future moments yet to happen, casting their shadows backward through time. And I was seeing the accumulated weight of my own predetermined actions, every choice I would make in the coming hours already written in phantom light. I walked to the wall because I had already walked to the wall. I pressed my hand against it because in every timeline and every echo, this was what I did next. Free will was an illusion painted over the rails of inevitability, and I was watching myself slide toward whatever waited behind that plaster, like a train that had always been heading toward this particular crash. The wall was cool beneath my palm, smooth, unremarkable, but when I closed my eyes and listened, I heard something. A rhythm, regular, patient, like breathing. Like something breathing. I grabbed a butter knife from the kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. Around me, 100 phantom versions of myself did the same, all of us moving in synchronicity. Across different moments, all of us excavating the same spot with the same desperate urgency that felt less like choice and more like compulsion written into the architecture of time itself. The plaster came away in chunks, revealing the wooden slat beneath, and behind that, darkness. A space that shouldn't exist between my apartment and my neighbor's unit. A hollow place that swallowed light and exhaled cold air that smelled of ancient earth and older things. I should have stopped. Every rational part of my mind screamed to stop, to seal the wall, to run. But I could see myself in the phantoms, see the future versions of me reaching into that darkness, pulling something out, and I understood with crushing certainty that I had no choice. The timeline was fixed. What would happen had already happened, was happening, would always happen. My fingers brushed against something in the darkness. Something wrapped in cloth that felt like it had been waiting there since before the building was constructed, since before the city rose around it, perhaps since before time learned to flow in only one direction. I pulled it free, a bundle small enough to fit in my palm, bound with twine that crumbled at my touch. The cloth fell away like shed skin, revealing what lay within. It was a photograph, old, faded, showing my apartment exactly as it appeared now, down to the hole in the wall, down to the scattered plaster, down to me standing there holding the photograph itself. And in the photograph I held was another photograph, and in that one another, an infinite recursion spiraling inward like a scream folding in on itself forever. But it was the date printed on the back that stopped my heart. Written in handwriting I recognized as my own, taken January 19th, 2026, found January 19th, 2026, hidden January 19th, 2026, today's date. Not years ago, today. I looked up and every phantom version of myself was staring back at me now, no longer focused on the wall but on me, and I saw in their translucent faces the terrible understanding that I was about to comprehend, that I had always been about to comprehend. That understanding this moment was itself the trap, the loop, the recursive nightmare from which there was no exit, because I would hide the photograph again. I could see myself doing it in the phantoms, see my future self sealing the wall, see the timeline closing around this moment like a fist. I would forget or pretend to forget until my eyes began showing me after images again, until I started seeing myself staring at the wall, until I carved through the plaster and found the photograph that I myself had hidden, was hiding. The breathing behind the wall grew louder, and I realized it had never been breathing at all. It was time itself, inhaling and exhaling the same moment over and over, and I was caught in its lungs. And every blink showed me another iteration, another loop, another version of myself discovering this same truth and hiding it away because that was what the timeline demanded, what it had always demanded, what it would always demand. I reached for the wall to seal it because I had already reached for it, would always reach for it, and somewhere in the phantom echoes of tomorrow, I was already forgetting this had ever happened, already moving toward the next iteration of the loop with the photograph hidden once more in its hollow place, waiting. And the breathing continued, patient as stone, eternal as recursion.